Thank you for having me here this morning. Good morning. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land, the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So how is the prevention of violence everybody's business? Well, I was a journalist for 25 years. I'm now a journalist and academic, and I can tell you that it is the media's fault, because everything is the media's fault. If I can get this to go forward. So Clive Palmer, for example, or Kevin Rudd, Jackie Lambie and the burqa, all the media's fault. Or what about climate change absolutely not being the result of human activity? Children overboard, terrorists in our backyard. Of course, they're not all actually the media's fault. We've got to separate the message from the messenger. But these days, it is more the media's fault than it used to be. In the recent old days, before the advent of the news on the internet, journalism was actually a very noble profession. It started BC in Rome, 59 BC, with something called the Acta Diurna, and it went on to become the independent watchdog of the other pillars of a democratic society. So it became what's known as the fourth estate. It's keeping the bastards honest, basically. So it was the fourth estate, the one looking at the other three estates, which were church, government and the hoi polloi, or the commoners, or the public. And it was there to be able to get down into the truth, to report facts, to be able to give the information to a civilised society so that they were then able to act within a democracy to assert their right to what it is that they wanted in their society. And that's something at the Centre for Advancing Journalism that we absolutely believe in. That's our ethos. That's how we teach journalism to our master's students, and that's how the paradigm through which we look at all our research. But since the advent of the internet and news on the internet, there have been, well, before that actually, there are probably two main changes. One was which has made the media perhaps slightly less noble, and one was about 8 years ago in 2006 when media ownership laws were changed. The whole point of media ownership being as diverse as possible and being somewhat Australian-based was to be able to give a diversity of views, therefore to better inform the populace in a democracy. But the laws were changed about media ownership in 2006 to allow greater concentration of ownership and to remove some of the regulations on foreign ownership. And so as a result, Australia now has one of the most concentrated media ownerships in the world. For example, as you probably know, Murdoch's News Corporation and the Fairfax Corporation own 11 of the 12 capital daily newspapers here in Australia. And so it's got the concomitant lack of diversity of views, and as we saw in the last federal election, a great potential to use vested interest propaganda run as news and opinion, with catastrophic consequences to our ability to make informed choices. Now, the second change, which was really a revolution of which you're all completely aware, was, of course, when news started going onto the internet, and with it, of course, eyeballs went across to it, and news then became dictated by a 24-hour news cycle because it was there all the time. It was being perpetuated and invented all the time, or run all the time. The most direct impact this had on legacy media, which is what we call the ones that are around before the internet, so newspapers, TV and radio, and also online news reporting, is that there's no time to check facts, there's no time to be investigative, there's no time to go back to a source. Even the most august people like the ABC are finding that they have to file every hour. So in my day, when I was an active journalist, we had one story a day. Well, I was on TV and radio, so if I was on radio, of course, I had a lot more as a talk radio. But for news, one story a day, and same with newspapers. Now, journalists are filing, as I say, every hour, because there's an online presence, there's the web page, there's Tumblr, there's Facebook, there's all sorts of blogs. And for example, the impact that this has on even the ABC, when Ted Baillieu, who was then Premier of this state, was holding a press conference where it was thought he would resign, the two ABC reporters were standing outside doing live crosses to base, didn't get the announcement, and it was run through Canberra and back to the ABC because someone else was in the room. They picked it up from Channel 7. So, there's a real pressure now on good journalists to keep being good journalists, but they're picking things up from Twitter and so on, and they haven't got time to do it. And the second impact of the 24-hour news cycle or online is that the funding base or the business model for legacy media has moved, because when the eyeballs moved from paid journalism, the press, which is print journalism, all the advertisers went, and the advertisers are actually the basis of print. They have propped it up forever. They have been the building. The price of a newspaper or subscriptions doesn't even pay for the ink. It all comes from the advertisers. So when the advertisers went, newspapers started going into free fall, and they're going into free fall now. As you know, Murdoch is pumping a lot of money into the Australian to keep that political presence here, but Fairfax is, well, bets are on about how long it will last. So this means that there's no one to pay trained journalists, because there's not a good business model online yet. There are 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 online publications that have got a bit of a business base, but by and large people who are writing online aren't funded and aren't trained. They're citizen journalists, or they're doing blogs, and they haven't been trained in what it is to be a journalist, why you do it, where you find your sources, how to double check your sources, what the ethics and accuracy are involved in being a journalist, and what it means to a democracy. So news media today is in a state of flux, from legacy to new, with as yet no established business models for the new, and a shift from accurate and authoritative to a reflector of opinions and more dodgy standards of accuracy and ethics. So, it is the media's fault, but is violence against women the media's fault? And if in any way it is, does that mean we can help the media we can get the media to help prevent violence against women? Well, I know we've all been hit on the head by these horrible statistics again and again, but I do need to use them as a baseline so that we're all operating on the same page right now for this talk. So I'll just briefly go through these horrible statistics. Between 1 and 2 women in Australia are killed by their intimate partner every single week. It's the lead cause of death and disability of women of childbearing age in Australia, greater than smoking and obesity combined. You heard yesterday, every 3 hours a woman is hospitalised by abuse from her intimate partner. It's the key driver for homelessness for women and children. Costs the economy, it's now more than that, about 15 billion, 1.2 or 1.4% of the GDP. And 1 in 3 women have experienced physical violence. That's 1 in 3. So in this room, I'm betting it would be more. That's one of the reasons some of us are involved with it. And 1 in 5 have experienced sexual violence. Now, over half of all women who are murdered have been murdered by the person who supposedly loves them or loved them. And of all homicides, both male and female, more than 1 in 5 is the intimate partner, but 3/4 of these, the victims are women. And 90% of the perpetrators are men. And overall, men commit homicide 7 times more than women. So you can understand why there was some shortness of patience yesterday in the panel about going softly when talking about this kind of thing with men. So from this large literature review, global literature review, we can see that violence against women is the greatest crime story in Australia. It reflects a very deep problem that we have here in Australia, and on any measure you'd have to say it's a great social significance what's happening to women by men. It reflects disturbing norms in society and expect it to be one of the major stories that are run every day in our newspapers. But it's underreported by the mainstream media. It's almost always doesn't have the social context taken into account, which is it's a man killing a woman and it's her partner or her ex-partner doing it, and it's endemic, and it comes from sexist attitudes which are held by most men. And intimate partner violence is particularly underreported in news reporting. So let's look at what causes violence against women, just to recap again so that we're on the same page. I know that you all know this because all of you are versed in this or work in this and have heard it before. This is just to show that, you know, the academic, yeah, it's all been, this is coming from the literature. Just very briefly, that's terribly small. I hope some of you can see it. I didn't realise how small it was. It's obviously the unequal gender balance between men and women that's directly correlated towards violence against them. The less power women have in relation to men, the more violence there is by men against women. The more men are adhering to traditional gender roles, the more likely they are to be violent to women. Men are more likely to express violence, beliefs than women. And men perpetuate violence against women because they hold negative attitudes towards them. They identify with traditional masculinity stereotypes and male privilege. They have rigid gender roles and no support or weak support for gender equality. And the culture in which everybody is in is a masculine dominant culture. So in shorthand, it's sexist attitudes, if you can translate that in traditional gender role attitudes and inequity towards women, that are the key causes of violence against women. So where do these attitudes in society come from? And a lot of you must work in this area and you probably know this better than I. But from lots of different things, of course, our individual experiences are clearly our gender, which is what we're mostly talking about, our families, our organisations, our communities. As you heard yesterday, in some cases it feels like it's almost in the DNA because it starts from the minute that you're born. The division of gender roles is that deeply rooted. And because we live in a patriarchy, it's still the dominant role model. They become norms and then they sustain or sanction violence against women. And the media has a role in this, of course, very obviously by affecting people's lives because it shapes their opinions and their attitudes and their beliefs. Now, this is a statement, and I'm going to be examining this much more in detail in the talk. It's also the direct subject of what we're studying at the Centre for Advancing Journalism. We're doing action research on. But it actually invisibly transfers the dominant ideology, and I'll explain what I mean in just a moment. So the media is sort of part of the social construct of identity and of knowledge. And by that I mean the media is set up as an objective reflector of facts. So the public's view is actually of an issue being in large part given to them by mass media using images and content. So it is a social construction of the public's knowledge from the media coming from a particular paradigm and saying that's what news is. Feminist theory would say that the media is not neutral. Rather, it evinces the power and point of view of the elites who operate and focus the media. That is, the gender, political and economic elites. And that is white, middle-class, middle-aged men and their interests. In addition, feminist theory suggests that the media, by publishing or broadcasting stories that they have determined or it has determined to be the news, that's what news is, that's the news agenda, they set the agenda for public discussion and they determine which issues and people are worthy of media coverage. So news judgment, and this is my experience, but again, as I say, we're actually doing research into this, empirical evidence-based research. So news judgment is subjective and it depends on who's making the choices that are newsworthy. And in this way, women become invisible in news media, either eliminated or trivialised in news coverage. And I'll talk about that a bit later, but Clementine Ford mentioned this very eloquently yesterday. So the media holds traditional male dominance attitudes. Let's look at that. Now, I'll put this together because this actually does both statistically but also visually capture what the media is like in Australia or how it actually is. You can see all those men and you can see the stereotype of what the woman should be and mostly is. So let's look now at the media. So what's the role of men and what's the role of women in the media? I'm going to look at power in the media. So we're going to look at who owns it, who runs it, who writes it, who the sources in it. So who owns the media? Well, I just said before, and I don't know what gremlin got into. It must have been one of my minions that I don't have who didn't, do the formatting. But anyway, so this is Murdoch and Fairfax owning 92% of the media in Australia, the print media in Australia. So we've got this concentrated media ownership. Don't be fooled by the picture of a woman. I know it's Gina Reinhardt. I'm not saying that she's not a woman. I mean that she owns 14.9% of Fairfax. She's the largest single owner, but almost all the rest are men, is what I meant to say. So if we look at who owns the media in Australia, basically it's in three groups. Down the bottom we've got the national broadcasters like the ABC and SBS. We did have community broadcasters. Their funding has just been removed by this government. Then there up the top we've got the big publicly traded companies, and as you can see, News Corp and Fairfax. Then we've got the big financial institutions which run things like Seven and Nine and so on, and they're 90% men who own them, the shareholders are. So when we look at who runs the media, you look at the boards of management. The chairs are 99% male. I know you can read this yourself, but look at those statistics, just run your eyes down it. So these are the people who are actually running the media. Chairs are 99% male. In the private companies, the boards are 85% male. At Nine, 100%. Seven, 89%, ABC and SBS, because they have a charter for equal representation, 50% male and female. But when you look at the executive, that is the management that runs it, the board sets the strategic direction, as you know, the management does the hard yakka and makes the decisions. 96% male CEOs of the media in Australia at ABC and SBS, they're both blokes. And the executive teams of all of them are 83% male. So they're owning it and running it. Now, this is now looking at who makes the decisions, which are the editors they're the ones who say, this is newsworthy, this is going to be our news agenda, these are the kind of stories, this is our brand, this is what we're going to say is newsworthy, and then these are the kind of stories we're going to do. This research is a snapshot taken in March 2013 by Wendy Bacon, who, as you know, is a Walkley Award-winning journalist, and she was the head of the Centre for Independent Media Studies at the University of Technology in Sydney, and she writes for New Matilda as well. She's an amazing, inspirational woman. Anyway, this is some of the work that she did. So at this snapshot, editors around Australia were 61% men, so nearly 2/3 men, but there was no woman who edited a weekday daily or a national metropolitan publication. When you looked at who has bylines, that's when you look at the paper and you see their name next to the story, it's over 2/3 men. So they're the ones getting the authority and the kudos. So it's men who know things. When you look at this opinion pieces, which are slightly different, they can be columnists and so on, as well as byline pieces, you can see that it's between 2/3 and 3/4, or more than 3/4 men. And if you look at across the organisations, it's much the same in all of them. It's overwhelmingly men whose opinions and whose voices are being heard. Now, who's the expert? That means the source that is talked about, you know, they go to for some kind of expert analysis or the voice that's heard. This is incredibly important because this is the normalising, this is the interpretation of what's going on in society, the people we listen to. Again, overwhelmingly men. And across all the different newspapers, overwhelmingly men. 75, 3/4 men. So you'd have to say, from looking at that, who owns and runs it, it's the mainstream media in Australia is overwhelmingly owned and run by men. They make the decisions, they have the authority, they're the experts, and they're the sources. The next question you need to ask is whether this male dominance is reflected in the news decisions and the reporting on violence against women. So let's look at this. What a surprise. This is the kind of thing that we do have in our media. Down the bottom we've got, you know, the women who present news, they're judged on how blonde they are. Up the top we've got a magazine that's got two really important people, the man's dressed and the woman's naked. I think the ad for Tom Ford speaks for itself. Then up the top again we've got an article of dissecting women's bodies and what's good, and then we've got women in chains. Now this is a really, I'm just looking at the time to make sure I've got time. This is a really horrifying thing. You might have seen it, I don't know, online, but an English university did an experiment to see, it looked at boys' magazines, lads' mags as they call them, the soft ones like Zoo and FHM, and it took some of the lines that men had written in that and it compared them to the lines, quotes from rapists who had been actually charged with rape. And I've mixed them up here and have a little read, and then I'd like you to work out which is which. I'm sorry it's pretty revolting. I took out the most revolting because it's just too upsetting, but... Okay, have you read those? Okay, so which ones are the rapists, do you think? Someone want to say? Which ones are the men writing in magazine for young men? Number one is just a young man. Number two is a rapist. The ones with stars are the rapists, the others are just what is out there for young men and women to read and is published. Now, that's just anecdotal. Let's look at actually some academic research on how violence against media is reported. This is a 2012 study by Morgan and Politov that looked at over 2,452 Victorian articles over 20 years reporting violence against women. And what they found was that it's reported as if it's random. It's not reported as if it's like an epidemic of men doing this to women. So it's from people with problems. And does that sound familiar, what we're still reading today? There's a particular focus on stranger danger. It's not ones we know, but it's the men out there who are kind of weird. Largely absent from the coverage was any sexual violence committed by intimate partners or former partners, when we know this is the major cause of death to women. And if an intimate partner had raped a woman, it's 40 times less likely to be published by the newspaper than a rape by a stranger. So they're perpetuating the idea that it's strangers who do it. And lastly, the sources that the newspapers quoted are overwhelmingly police and lawyers, not those who know about the social context, not those working in the area. So reporting on violence against women is cursory, and it doesn't reflect the reality of it being a male on female. It doesn't say it was a woman who was hurt or killed. It was a man who did it. They had been in a relationship, and this is happening all the time, and it's happening because of. It didn't report that, the reality of it. And yet the key causes of violence against women are the same values that are underpinning mainstream newsrooms. And you would think then you'd make a link that if it's sexist in the newsrooms, then it's sexism that's causing violence against women. Isn't the media somewhat directly to blame, or at least part of the blame? And you would look at this, but I think we need, and you can actually look at some of the things that are happening. For example, just recently, and I know that Clem talked about these yesterday, but you look at the more recent coverage that we've just seen, like the Lockhart murders near Wagga Wagga, where Jeff Hunt murdered his wife and his 3 children. And it was reported as if, he was an upstanding, lovely man. And I'll just quote from the Sydney Morning Herald, which is a Fairfax paper. Jeff and Kim Hunt and their children, Fletcher, Mia and Phoebe, will be remembered for being active and generous members of the Lockhart community. This is when they were buried. Really? I mean, he won't be remembered as the man who murdered his wife and 3 children? He's not an upstanding member of the community. And then just more recently, when we've had the terrible murder of Mayang Prasetyo, the Indonesian woman who was murdered horribly by, well, you can't be murdered well, who was murdered by her partner. And again, Clem mentioned this yesterday, but the coverage was unbelievable. A transgender cabaret performer killed by her boyfriend, killer chef and she-male, as if somehow she's to blame for the fact that she's been murdered by her partner. That as if her gender, her sexuality, her occupation has anything to do whatsoever with the fact that this man has committed an atrocity to her. It makes me sick to my stomach, and I must say it's very cheering to see in some ways on social media, as I did last night when I tap into the younger people, how strongly they feel about this. So many of them are so horrified and disgusted by this kind of talk. And Clem kindly sent me her talk yesterday because I wasn't here for it, and I want to just quote one bit of it because I think that she summarises it so well. She said, "When we turn perpetrators into victims whose actions must be understood, we are turning victims into ciphers whose suffering is the unfortunate consequence of male pain and not a harrowing result of unregulated entitlement." And the media is responsible for that. And I think it's shown by the latest Violence Against Women report, or the Community Attitudes report that's just come out from Vic Health. Vic Health has done 3 of them now. It came out last month. The one before that was 2009, so this is 4 years on, and there were some really disappointing regressions in our attitudes towards violence against women. And these are that, and I think Kristen Deemer will be speaking about these at the conference, but because she's one of the authors of the report. But 3/4 of Australians find it hard to understand why women stay in abusive relationships. 3/4. Half of all Australians believe that women could leave if they really wanted to leave. 1 in 5 Australians believe violence can be excused if the offender later apologises. 1 out of every 10 Australians agrees that if a woman doesn't physically resist, then she's not really saying no. Physically resist. Twice as many people will excuse sexual assault if the woman is affected by alcohol or drugs at the time. So there's obviously a lot of work to be done in and of the media to do something about this, to change it. So at this stage, it certainly is the media's fault. It's partly the media's fault, what's happening to women. But we need to be very careful about this, because although it looks like a sexist media is perpetuating sexist attitudes in the community, the link is at this stage only circumstantial. We haven't done the research, and that's what we're doing. What we're doing is, this is the missing evidence. Sure, a newsroom might be sexist, but do we really know that that's how it influences, that sexism influences what it sees as stories? That's feminist theory, but does it influence how news agendas are put together? Does it influence the stories and the kind of stories, the tone of them, the choice of them and the tone of them that are actually written? And does what's written actually affect community attitudes? They're suppositions at this stage, and this is the work that we're doing at the Centre for Advancing Journalism. We've started on it. We've got lined up a number of absolutely amazing partners, and we've done some of the work. But we're applying for, those of you who are academics will understand this, an Australian Research Council linkage grant, which is going in next week sometime. And so depending on that funding, we will be doing the rest of the work that I'm about to describe to you. But on our team, we're fortunate enough to have as industry partners Vic Health and Domestic Violence Victoria. And we have on our team, as a Chief Investigator, Michael Flood, who with Bob Peace has done a lot of this background work and has been very instrumental in the community attitude surveys, and Jenny Morgan, who's done a lot of the work on media and violence against women reporting, as well as our own team, and Dennis Muller, who is an academic who teaches law and ethics with us, but he has also done a lot of work. Well, he was one of the partners in the Solwick polling, so he's doing a lot of our methodological looking and surveying at the community attitudes, how they change with what's presented to them in the media. And most importantly, we, through a lot of hard work over 18 months, have been fortunate enough to now gain access to the Herald Sun, which is Murdoch's largest daily newspaper in Australia, and to Mamamia, which is an online women-only publication, and a major TV news outlet that I can't name at the moment because we're just signing the deal. So we've got 3 different kinds of mainstream newsrooms that we're going, or major newsrooms that we're going to be going into, and actually finding out how the news agenda, what are the factors that influence their news agendas, and then what are the factors that influence the way the stories are written and or edited or viewed and or put out. And then we'll be looking at how that output is affecting communities, the readers over time through focus groups. And then more than that, because of this, the Herald Sun, we're going to be able to look at how a mainstream sexist newspaper can actually change the way in which it reports on violence against women. Because you probably all remember that just over a year ago, or maybe more, maybe 18 months ago, some months after Jill Meagher was murdered in Brunswick in Melbourne, the Herald Sun started a campaign called Take a Stand. And it started by profiling, having these major male leaders like our hero Ken Lay, the Police Commissioner in Victoria, the Lord Mayor, the head of the AFL, the head of the Army, whom we heard yesterday, David Morrison, and other male leaders standing up and saying, we're taking a stand, no more. It's men's responsibility. We've all got to take responsibility. When you hear a man say something sexist, you stop him, or else you're part of this. And as part of that, they started doing really good reporting on violence against women in context, saying what the relationship was, saying that it was a man killing a woman, saying what the relationship was, putting it in a social context, interviewing people who are actually in the sector. And so they've started doing really good coverage. So, as I say, we're fortunate enough to have access to go in there and find out through in-depth interviewing, and we've started that process already without the funding, just what it was, what are the factors that made them start to change. And the importance of this is that once you know what factors will make a sexist male paradigm, male normative place start to change its view and its importance on the way in which it does things, then you start to get a look at if there are any kind of, qualitative differences and factors that lead to it. You can maybe transfer them in a way that will work into other news organisations, and through a sort of a viral spread, you might actually be able to amplify the impact and start the reporting and the coverage of violence against women in a way that actually tells the story and stops the kind of attitudes that we're seeing towards women. And that's our aim, is to have an intervention. That's the third part of our research project. It's an action research project. We will take what we learn and we will have an intervention in other newsrooms. I just want to briefly mention the fact, of course, that new media is, online media is where so many of the eyeballs are these days. And we have great hopes of this, although we did start up a couple of new media sites and they really need an enormous amount of work. But the point of new media, or the hope for it, is that it's not hierarchical. Well, it is getting hierarchical now that it's getting a bit of a business model, but it's, citizen journalists, people at home can blog. Anyone can actually write anything on the media. Of course, it's got online. Of course, that's got good and bad sides to it, as I said earlier. But in terms of violence against women, it does mean that women can directly write their own stories, and women can report on this issue and can get it picked up and run in more mainstream ways, like Clem, for example. But there are lots of really good online areas like New Matilda, and some of Mamma Mia's stuff has been very strong on this, and so on. So we want to look at whether new media can actually provide a more balanced and ethical and accurate reporting of violence against women, and if that would lead to the mitigation of attitudes towards violence against women. And this is why, because we think it would allow context and gender analysis, women telling their stories directly, and we could actually put the right trigger warnings on, not just, oh, this poor man's got a mental disorder, so here's a suicide helpline, but in fact, if you're suffering from domestic violence, or, if you're really upset by this, these are the helps for you, the woman. And so we'll include solutions experts and initiatives. That's the kind of thing we'd be looking at and we're hoping for. But the work we have to do in this, which is one of the 4 prongs of the work we're doing, one is establishing how news agendas and outputs are made. The next is what impact it has on communities. The next is doing this work with new media, and the next is implementing change across lots of different newsrooms. So we actually have to establish what the gender balance in new media, newsrooms and reporting is. I mean, is it different? Is it still blokey? Does it still adopt the male paradigm? We don't know that yet. And then we have to look at the kind of coverage that there is, and whether or not that has... so we're going back a step, if you like, with new media, going back to what Morgan and Politoff did, to see what kind of reporting on violence against women that there is in new media, and see whether, in fact, it's slightly better. But these are some of the online news publications, some of which have very strong and very good articles and coverage of violence against women. So already, anecdotally, it does look like they're a whole lot better than the legacy press, but that empirical evidence has to be gained from proper academic research. So how can the media help prevent violence against women? Well, we can use the empirical data that we've got from this study when we get it, because everything has to be evidence-based, and you can see how much the earlier work by Vic Health in their community attitude surveys is used again and again. It's they who have found most of the evidence that we work on today, along with reference to the ABS and police records and so on. So we use the empirical data not only on what actually happens, but on the change factors to affect change. We develop innovative, collaborative, effective means of influencing news agendas and outputs. And I should say there's a lot of research that shows that social change comes from an individual level by constructing and naming a problem that's important, because it helps individuals define their personal experiences and choose a course of action. And at the social level, naming a problem can lead to the formulation of a solution. And feminist theory advocates partnerships between advocates, law enforcement and the media in order to facilitate social awareness and provide evidence that coalitions working with journalists can be successful for the proper identification of violence against women. And this is what we would hope to do with the empirical evidence that we have, to take it and then work in a collaborative way with journalists, not shoving it down their throat, because we all know how journalists operate, you can't tell them nothing, but work with them so that we're able to affect change in their attitudes, to see this as an incomplete story that they're telling, and they need to tell a better story, a stronger story, the real story of crime in Australia, including social and new media, and establish... that was what we have to do for new media. And so all of this will take all these things: commitment, good faith, good research, good funding, good eyeballs going the right places, brains and business models to support of all this. And so, as everyone is ending, it is everybody's business, this way that the media can help prevent violence against women. Thank you for your time.